As London becomes increasingly expensive to live in, work in and travel around, it is at risk of being hollowed out and losing the vibrancy that makes it such a desirable place to live and work for young people. Should we be looking to solve the issue of affordability through increased densification of the centre or through decentralisation, encouraging a greater mix of uses in outer London centres? Thinking about London as a polycentric city with clusters of activity across the whole capital? As part of the London Real Estate Forum NextGen initiative, G&T hosted a roundtable in partnership with New London Architecture, bringing together 12 built environment professionals from across the industry to debate the solution, using research and their own experience as drivers for change.
I learned an important lesson in the art of the debate. Present your arguments clearly, arm yourself with cutting wit, and of course, bob and weave.
We are arguing for decentralisation as a solution to the affordability issue in London. Do you enjoy the anonymity that essentially turns into animosity of living in central London? The second question is, do you enjoy your increasingly packed commute? And the final question, do you enjoy spending an average of £4.40 on a pint, which is apparently the average, and do you enjoy spending an additional £14 in your weekly shop compared to the northern regions? Because that's what we're spending, that's what the average is. No one enjoys that. But the truth is that we live in a city where almost sort of moving towards inhumane conditions are forced upon us. We can look at decentralisation as a model to solving this. So it's the act of encouraging this polycentric development, which, by the way, is how London has formed into what it is today, to move towards a more affordable city.
Centralisation, whether you like it, loathe it, hate it, or just get on with it, is something that us humans just do. And our key argument of this entire debate is, why try and go against the flow, against something that is inherent in the very nature of our existence? We would argue that actually centralisation stretches right from Stratford all the way to White City as a minimum. And actually key for us is that the neighbourhoods in between them offer a vast diaspora of different living arrangements, communities, and crucially, the ability to live in one and work in the other. And that diversity is key for making sure centralisation works. And I'll put it to you that there's no better way of therefore ensuring our progress, our survival, and ultimately succeeding by embracing centralisation.
That showed it to you, hasn't it? Decentralisation. I hope you've got some points to react to on that. Very well put, thank you.
I think it's important to note that decentralisation isn't about destroying the centre, but it's about, as we were saying, about creating other viable centres or a polycentric economy or a polycentric city. Having other successful conurbations is about decentralisation. So going back to OECD statistics, they actually show that countries that have stronger regional bases, i.e. go for decentralisations, have more resilient economies, which is increasingly important in a world of globalisation.
So Tom, we've heard an anthropological argument from James about how we like to live in communities, but haven't we just heard from Sherin and from Liam exactly why London is already working well in the way that it operates? Well, how would you respond?
I think the home ownership point is a little bit of a red herring, because London historically was always a town of renters. Now it's all this conversation on home ownership. I think the new generations want flexibility and want mobility. There's been this whole conversation about quantity of space, and we've recently run a survey. Quality housing is more desirable than quantity. There's a qualitative conversation that's been lost in a lot of the discussions around housing in the UK, and well-designed smaller spaces promote happiness better than poorly designed larger spaces.
Even if less people own their homes at the moment, rents in central London are unaffordable, and tenure is insecure, so there's not equality in terms of life choices in living in those circumstances. Whilst you could argue that maybe the units are nice or reasonable, the mental well-being that goes with it is not being provided at the moment.
Compact living has demonstrated that you can actually provide affordable living within the inner city It's also a valid model for zones 3 and onwards. It doesn't have to be in zones 1, 2. That provides denser living.
The perception of and the experience of the urban cores since the 1920s has changed. It's no longer seen as kind of the polar opposite to the suburban idyll where you'd move out to have kind of green space for your children. People are realising that you can have that life within the city centre.
So Ruth, that sounds pretty like a slam dunk to me in terms of how one should live in the city. What's your view of that?
I think it's important to remember that as much as we are proposing decentralisation, we're thinking about the community at the heart of it, and it's not necessarily an isolated place. It's a settlement developing around existing nodes or creating new nodes within a network or a series of spaces that all interconnect in a corridor, a network. It's elaborating on the polycentric city. We're not creating isolated spaces which don't have infrastructure and services that people need.
What we haven't looked at is if businesses actually move out as well, and we're not saying completely move out, we're just saying if they give their workers opportunities for flexible working, remote working, maybe membership offices that they can go in, meet clients, do video conferencing from a local office, then that gives them the choice. It means that they can downsize in central London. It takes the pressure off the infrastructure network. The workers can cycle, walk to work, have more flexibility. It's got to be a collaborative effort, and the businesses do need to buy into that.
It's how do you incentivise big business to relocate those outer London centres? I cannot see it happening in my lifetime. It's not just providing affordable housing, it's distribution of wealth. So therefore you've got to get economy moving out, and it's how you solve that.
Look around at Canary Wharf. My granddad was a docker around that sort of area, and obviously look at how that's changed into sort of a thriving place where you've got huge multinational businesses who are basing themselves there. I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy, but there are ways that you can decentralise these businesses to come out of London, and tax incentives are one of those. Councils need to sustain themselves through a funding mechanism, and that's going to be through the business rates relief. So it's imperative that they get businesses to these boroughs and things like that, and they need to work out how to do that.
It's interesting talking about businesses and where they want to locate, and I think inevitably big businesses want to locate where they can access the most talent and the biggest talent pool and the most diverse range of talent, and inevitably, to me, that's the city centre.
It's all very well, but isn't he putting an argument for a hub model that essentially is the decentralisation model?
See, I would completely reject the hub model that you're describing, and from the very outset of my argument, I and my teammates have made it very clear: you can't have Stratford, it's ours. You can't have White City, it's ours. It is part of the centralised model. If you want Milton Keynes, you can have it. That's a decentralised model. That is a spoke, hub and spoke model. Milton Keynes was built for those very reasons of creating it.
I think one of the key points that the other team mentioned earlier was this idea of urban sprawl or suburbia as being associated with decentralisation, and that's not what we're advocating for at all. It's very specific points of decentralised nodes around public transport, which can easily be connected into this network, this polycentric city, which effectively is a network.
In terms of the city, we've got 10,000 residents. We're in the process of trying to increase that. We've got our first major shopping centre in One New Change next to St Paul's. So in terms of the city, has been one-dimensional. You used to take your briefcase and your cheese sandwich to work, and I think the days of the bowler hat are over. But I've spotted one or two, but things have moved on a bit. But in terms of they're talking about transport nodes, but all those roads, all those train links, they all lead to the city of London, don't they? And in terms of orbital transport, they're not connected.
We don't have a unified definition of what the centre of London is. If I asked you to go for a drink tonight and I said, shall we meet in the centre, you wouldn't reply, yes, at Earl's Court then, would you? Or you wouldn't say, we'll meet in Stratford. You'd say, St Paul's or somewhere around there. You wouldn't say these places. So in absence of a definition, let's just think what we socially think centralisation is. What do we think central London is? And in terms of transport, just because we're moving outside of London doesn't mean it takes an age. I mean, look at cycle superhighways. Look at those sorts of things. Transport for London, yes, there'll be some bias here, but we're putting in these sorts of things to mean that if you live a bit further outside of London, you can actually get in quicker than you could before these cycle superhighways were, even though you sort of lived half the way in.
You can use space a bit more smartly. It doesn't necessarily mean that the space that you're saving from sprawling out of the ground becomes your green space within that development. You're thinking a bit bigger, and you can, when you have a centralised argument, you can think more holistically about how you're going to use the space on a more general level.
I think King's Cross is a great example of that. The regeneration of King's Cross has been hugely successful. It's night and day different to what it was. They've done it in a way that is a very pleasant place to live and work, with a lot of high rise, and they must have created a huge amount of extra square footage for offices, homes, and I think that's a great example of densifying our centre.
Thank you.
I think there is a big question about what centre of London is and what centralisation is. We need to think of it relatively rather than a formula that is used elsewhere. And once you think about it relatively, it actually makes sense to go for decentralisation because we're already seeing it happening. And this is where the big opportunities are. So if you do the sums, it doesn't make sense to go for a centrification model over decentralisation. It's just not viable, and if it's not viable, you're not going to get the investment needed.
Thank you very much.
We should all be comforted in the fact that we are all championing the place we call London. We should observe what's happening, and we should be confident in ourselves as real estate professionals and design professionals and professionals within the built environment that we can come up with the solutions for the problems and good design, thinking about things carefully and the way things are changing.
That was fascinating. I wouldn't dream of trying to come down on one side or the other myself, but I wondered if we could really throw away the arguments and the sides that we've taken over the last hour and a half and just have a show of hands just between us all. What do we think then of those in favour for decentralisation? Okay, well, decentralisation has it. Thank you all again for participating and doing your homework, which you clearly have, and now it's time to go and have a drink on G&T. Thank you.